The rain fell in thin veils over the manor courtyard, dissolving the distant echo of bells and the dust from the road. It was late autumn, and the earth exhaled the scent of what rots in silence. In the center of the mist, a carriage waited, black as the omen that accompanies forgotten names. From it descended a woman in a worn dress, her body curved not by age, but by the burden of having been delivered as merchandise. Her name, Lysandra, was no longer pronounced by the family that had sold her, only whispered by the servants like those who invoke a lament. Before we immerse ourselves in this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're following from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The villagers said she was born under a withered moon, incapable of generating life, and thus condemned to function as currency. Her parents, indebted and fearful, handed her over to the Lord of the North as if delivering a debt to the abyss. And now, before the iron gates of Aldermore, she was merely a contract sealed in cold, a body sold for silence and shame. The castle received her as winter itself receives a pilgrim, without warmth, without word, without return. The halls were vast, supported by columns that resembled ancient bones, and the air, impregnated with incense and rust. The maids observed her as if they feared touching her skin, murmuring stories about the master who did not age. They said the Lord of Aldermore never slept before dawn, that his gaze saw beyond flesh, and that his blood did not follow the same course as men's. Lysandra walked among shadows and carpets that muffled steps, with her hands bound before her body, her head lowered. Everything about her seemed contained, the gesture, the breath, the voice. Only her eyes, gray and sleepless, betrayed the fire of a soul that did not surrender. The symbol she carried was a simple ring, made of iron and engraved inside with a word in a lost language, inheritance from a grandmother the world had already forgotten. It was the only trace of what she had been before the sale, before the guilt, before becoming possession. His first appearance happened at dusk, when the sun dissolved into the clouds and the stained glass projected a ruby light onto the stone. The silence of the house changed as the air changes before a storm. No servant dared raise their eyes when he entered. The presence of the Lord of Aldermore needed no sound, just the weight of his gaze, the rumor of dark fabric, the exact compass of his steps. He observed her as one examines a wound open in time. He did not say her name. He only spoke, with a low and cold voice, something that sounded like a verdict. They have brought me a woman who bears no fruit. We shall see if it is the womb that is barren, or the heart. Those words echoed through the walls like steel. Lysandra did not respond. She merely raised her face, and in her gaze was what the man did not expect. Not fear, but something more silent and more dangerous, resistance. The tension that formed between them was not made of flesh, but of power. He, the absolute lord of his house and his secrets, she, condemned, but intact in her dignity. The house, which until then breathed in shadow, seemed to hold its breath. The following days dragged on between rituals and vigilance. The long dinner table was always occupied by few, Councillor Derham, who looked at her with disdain, Lady Celine, who had envy of the living beneath perfumes, and the old servant Oren, who observed her with pity, as if recognizing in her the mirror of what still remained human in that stone home. The conversations were about lineages, alliances, and inheritances, sharp words that bled without wounding. Lysandra ate in silence, like one who prays. Throughout these silent meals, she studied them all, the way Lady Celine's fingers tapped restlessly against crystal goblets, how Councillor Derham's eyes darted toward shadows as if expecting messengers, the manner in which the Lord himself seemed both present and elsewhere, his attention caught in currents no one else could see. Valdermore's nobility wore their breeding like armor, but underneath, Lysandra sensed uncertainty, the hesitation of those who guarded secrets so old they themselves have forgotten their origins. "Tomorrow you will begin your duties," Lady Celine announced one evening, her voice cutting through the silence like a silver blade. "Every woman who enters this household earns her place, even those who arrive as investments." At night, she wandered the corridors. The sound of her steps mingled with the wind that infiltrated through the cracks. Once, upon descending to the internal garden, a courtyard of black roses, she found the Lord of Aldermore among the shadows. He was motionless, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and the moonlight sculpted his face like marble. "Why did you come here?" he asked, without turning. "Because here the air seems more truthful," she replied. He turned then, slowly, and for an instant, the two looked at each other like creatures of distinct species, recognizing in the other a rare type of solitude. "The truthful," he said, approaching, "is always what cannot be shown." From that moment on, something began to change. It was not tenderness, nor pity. It was a restlessness that infiltrated between the silences. The Lord had become more reclusive, more attentive. His eyes, once cold, lingered upon her with the hesitation of one who discovers himself vulnerable. The servants noticed and began to murmur, "The barren woman has bewitched the master." And like every rumor in an ancient house, the murmur turned to accusation. On a night of banquet, before the guests and the court, Lady Selene, consumed by jealousy, raised her glass and declared, with a melodious and venomous voice, "There are things that blood does not forgive. The Lord has welcomed under this roof a cursed woman. What fruits can be given by one whose own womb has refused?" The hall fell silent. Lysandra remained motionless, her gaze turned to the candle that trembled on the table. Then, the dry sound of glass breaking filled the air. The Lord of Valdemar had crushed his cup with his hand. The wine ran like blood between his fingers. "Who decides the value of a human being?" he asked, without raising his voice. "The flesh, the name, or the courage to remain whole in the face of humiliation?" The gesture was a sentence. No gaze dared cross his. The public humiliation of the woman had been transformed into a judgment of the very world that rejected her. Lysandra, even in silence, had become the mirror of everyone's conscience. And the Lord, by defending her, exposed himself to what he had always feared to feel. That night, the castle did not sleep. The wind blew through the towers with a sound that resembled ancient prayers. Lysandra, alone in her room, looked through the window at the covered sky and understood that something had been altered forever. The contract that had bound her there had transformed into something else, a pact not of blood, but of destiny. The man who had bought her body had become a prisoner of her presence. The Lord of Valdemar had chosen the barren woman, and the entire world, in silence, awaited the price of that choice. Winter would come soon, and with it, the proof of what could still flourish among ruins. In the days that followed, Lysandra noticed subtle shifts in the household's rhythm. Servants who had previously averted their eyes now stole curious glances. Lady Selene's visits became more frequent, her inquiries about Lysandra's comfort thinly veiling surveillance. Even Councillor Derham, with his perpetual scowl, began observing her movements with calculation rather than disdain. Most telling were the changes to her quarters, books appearing mysteriously on her nightstand, winter flowers in crystal vases, a silver hairbrush with her initial engraved upon the handle. Small courtesies that spoke of attention from someone who noticed details but avoided direct acknowledgement. She never thanked the Lord for these gestures, understanding instinctively that to do so would force recognition of something neither was ready to name. Instead, she began leaving her own silent replies, a sprig of black roses on his library chair, pages marked in books with pressed leaves, a pattern of candles arranged to mirror constellations they had once discussed. A private language developing between two people who could not safely speak directly. Morning arrived veiled in frost, the kind that turns breath into spectral clouds and makes stone weep. Lysandra woke to find a small parcel at her door, a leather-bound journal and a quill, left without note or explanation. She recognized it as permission, perhaps even invitation, to exist beyond silence. As her fingers traced the blank pages, a thought crystallized. In a house where words were weapons, writing might become armor. The great hall buzzed with hushed conversation that day. News had spread through Valdemar that the neighboring province had fallen to plague, a sickness that drained color from skin and left the eyes hollow, glassy pools. Borders were closing. The world was shrinking to the dimensions of survival. "We must seal the gates," Councillor Derham insisted, his thin lips barely moving as he spoke. "No one enters, no one leaves, especially not those with questionable bloodlines." His eyes slid toward Lysandra like ice across stone. The Lord stood at the window, shoulders rigid beneath his dark attire. "And what of those who seek shelter? Would you have them die at our threshold for fear of what they might carry?" Better them than us, Lady Selene interjected, her voice sweet as poison honey. After all, some lives are worth more than others. Isn't that why we have hierarchy, my lord? Isn't that why some rule while others serve? The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, charged, inevitable. Lysandra felt every eye in the room upon her, measuring her worth against her presence. She had become both metaphor and warning in their minds, the outsider, the pollutant, the risk. Fear, the Lord finally said, turning to face them, makes men build walls when they should build bridges. The plague is not what we should fear most. His eyes found Lysandra's across the room, a silent communication that seemed to say, I see beyond their blindness. Later, as dusk settled like ash across the grounds, Lysandra found herself drawn to the ancient library wing, a place few servants ventured, claiming the books whispered when left alone. The smell of parchment and binding glue hung in the air like incense. Candles guttered in their sconces, casting trembling shadows across spines embossed with forgotten languages. She did not hear him enter, only sensed the shift in air, the way silence deepened when disturbed by presence rather than sound. You seek knowledge, the Lord said, his voice softer here than anywhere else in the castle. Lysandra's fingers paused over a volume bound in midnight blue. I seek understanding. The library felt different at night, less a repository of knowledge than a living entity that breathed through leather and parchment. She had been drawn to a section older than the rest, where the spines bore no titles, only symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. Here, the candles burned with blue-tinged flames despite being made of ordinary tallow. Few venture into this collection, the Lord observed, watching her trace the strange markings on a particularly ancient tome. Most find the air, too, heavy for comfortable breathing. Lysandra realized he spoke truth. The air here felt dense, as if saturated with the weight of secrets. Her lungs worked harder, but she found the slight discomfort preferable to ignorance. Knowledge rarely comes without cost, she replied, meeting his gaze directly. Even breathing its presence requires strength. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had witnessed. It transformed his face from monument to man, revealing a dimple at one corner of his mouth that humanized him more effectively than any declaration could have. The expression vanished quickly, but its effect lingered between them like the scent of rain after drought. He moved beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him, not the chill of flesh, but something deeper, as if his very soul had been preserved in winter. There is a difference between being unable to bear life and choosing not to, he said, his eyes on the distant shelves. The first is misfortune. The second is wisdom. The words hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Lysandra felt her breath catch. And which am I, my lord? Unfortunate or wise? His hand moved toward hers, but stopped short of touching, hovering like a moth uncertain of flame. Perhaps you are the rarest thing of all, a truth in a house built on shadows. For the first time since her arrival, Lysandra saw vulnerability crack his marble facade. Behind his eyes lurked something ancient and exhausted, a loneliness that predated her arrival, perhaps even her birth. What happened to the women before me? She asked, the question escaping before caution could cage it. His face closed like a book snapped shut. They failed. At bearing children. At bearing the truth. He turned away, his profile sharp against the gloom. Rest tonight. Tomorrow brings the Frost Festival. The entire province will attend, and judge whether the Lord of Valdremore has lost his senses by keeping you. As he left, his shadow lingered longer than it should have, stretching against natural light. Lysandra shivered, understanding that she stood at a crossroads. The castle had secrets layered like sediment, and she had begun to disturb that carefully arranged darkness. In her room that night, she wrote in the journal by candlelight, her handwriting small and precise, I am not what they believe me to be. I am neither curse nor salvation. I am simply a woman who refuses to disappear. Perhaps that is power enough. Outside, the wind carried sounds like distant weeping, or perhaps it was laughter, cold and hollow as the spaces between stars. Winter tightened its grip around Valdremore, and with it came the sense that something long dormant was awakening, stretching after centuries of slumber. The Frost Festival would reveal more than allegiances. It would expose the fault lines in a foundation built on secrecy and fear, and Lysandra, despite her caution, had already begun to crack the surface. Lysandra closed the journal and moved to the window, pressing her palm against glass, so cold it burned. Below, in the courtyard, servants prepared for tomorrow's festivities, hanging crystalline lanterns, arranging ice sculptures that caught moonlight and transformed it into fractured rainbows. The beauty seemed incongruous against her growing sense of danger. A movement caught her eye, a solitary figure crossing the courtyard, crimson cloak billowing like a wound against the snow. Lady Selene, walking with purpose toward the eastern wing, where no festivities were planned. Her posture spoke of secrecy rather than celebration, of business conducted under cover of distraction. Without conscious decision, Lysandra found herself reaching for a shawl. Something pulled her toward knowledge, even as instinct warned of its price. The corridors were empty, the household focused on preparation or rest. Her footsteps made no sound on the stone floors, a skill learned through necessity rather than training. She followed at a distance, tracking the intermittent flash of crimson through gallery and corridor, down spiraling stairs that descended beyond the expected foundations of Valdemar. The air changed as she descended, growing not colder but charged, as if the stone itself conducted some subtle current. The walls glistened with moisture that caught torchlight and reflected it in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Ahead, Lady Selene's crimson form disappeared through a doorway that seemed carved directly from bedrock. Lysandra paused at the threshold, hearing voices from within, Lady Selene's melodious tones undercut by something deeper, a voice that seemed to emanate from stone rather than flesh. Words in a language Lysandra did not recognize, but somehow understood on a level beneath conscious thought. They spoke of preparation and culmination, of cycles and sacrifice, of vessels and contents. Of her. The morning of the Frost Festival arrived with a sky so pale it seemed the color had been bled from the world. Servants bustled through corridors, arms laden with evergreen boughs and silver ribbons. Ancient traditions dictated that on this day, even death paused its harvest. The veil between realms thinned, allowing past and present to mingle like mist. Lysandra stood before the looking-glass as a stone-faced handmaiden dressed her in layers of midnight blue silk, so deep it appeared almost black until light caught its folds. The gown had arrived without explanation, another silent command from the Lord. It fit as if crafted from her shadow, revealing the subtle strength in her frame rather than diminishing it. "They say it belonged to the First Lady of Valdemar," the handmaiden whispered, her fingers working silver clasps with practiced precision. "She wore it only once, on the night she vanished." "Vanished?" Lysandra repeated, meeting the woman's eyes in the reflection. The handmaiden's hands faltered. Some say she fled into the forest. Others believe she walks the corridors still, searching for what was denied her. Her voice dropped lower. "The master never speaks of her. It is forbidden to even say her name." Before Lysandra could inquire further, Lady Selene appeared in the doorway, her own gown a cascade of crimson that spilled around her feet like fresh blood. "How touching," she remarked, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Our little sparrow, dressed in finery she doesn't understand. Tell me, dear, do you know what the Frost Festival truly celebrates?" Lysandra remained silent, unwilling to provide ammunition. "It commemorates survival," Lady Selene continued, circling like a predator. "Those strong enough to endure when others perish. The weak freeze in winter, the strong consume what remains." She reached out, adjusting a silver clasp with unnecessary force. "Remember your place today. You are a curiosity, nothing more, like a malformed creature preserved in a jar." When she departed, her perfume lingered, something cloying and overripe, like flowers beginning to rot. The great hall had been transformed into a winter forest. White branches arched overhead, dripping with crystal ornaments that caught and fractured light. Lords and ladies from neighboring estates arrived in procession, their furs and jewels competing for attention. Each guest was announced with lineage and title, their worth measured in bloodlines and hectares. Lysandra stood at the periphery, aware of whispers that followed her movement. The dress seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the illusion that she moved through deeper shadow than those around her. "They call you the Barren Purchase," a quiet voice commented beside her. A young man with sharp features and eyes too old for his face offered a crystal goblet. "I am Nathaniel, third son of Lord Everin, which means I'm as irrelevant to these proceedings as you are presumed to be. Lysandra accepted the drink but did not taste it. And why would the third son of Lord Everin risk association with someone so clearly marked for isolation? His smile didn't reach his eyes. Because I recognize fellow pawns on this board. My brother is betrothed to Lady Celine's niece, a union that will consolidate more power than is wise for any family to possess. And you, my dear, have somehow disrupted a very carefully arranged game. By existing, she asked, watching the crowd part as the Lord of Valdemar entered. Even here, among peers, he seemed separate, untouchable in a way that inspired both envy and fear. By surviving, Nathaniel corrected. The last 3 women brought to Valdemar under similar circumstances were gone within a fortnight. Yet here you stand, wearing the gown of a ghost, meeting gazes that would prefer to look through you. Lysandra studied him more carefully, noting the subtle tremor in his hands, the too bright gleam in his eyes. Something about him seemed fractured, a coherent whole composed of misaligned pieces. You know more than you're saying, Lord Nathaniel. I know that history repeats with subtle variations. I know that Valdemar has always required blood to maintain its prosperity. I know that Lady Celine's family has orchestrated these arrangements for generations. His gaze shifted toward the chamber's eastern entrance, where an ancient tapestry depicted a winter hunt, wolves pursuing a white stag across a midnight landscape. I know that my own sister was once brought here, barren after a childhood illness. She lasted 23 days. Understanding bloomed cold in Lysandra's chest. Nathaniel hadn't approached her from political calculation, but from personal grief, recognition of a pattern he had witnessed before with someone he loved. The Lord seems different with you, Nathaniel continued, his voice dropping lower as a group of nobles passed. He watches you as if seeing a possibility rather than an inevitability. It disturbs certain factions. Lady Celine, Lysandra murmured. Among others. Her family has maintained influence through control of Valdemar's most precious resource, its lord's unnatural longevity. If he begins questioning tradition... He left the thought unfinished, but the implication hung between them like frost. They say the Lord's bloodline carries a curse, that no woman can bear his child and live. But I wonder if perhaps the curse is simply that he recognizes truth when he sees it, and that makes him dangerous to those who trade in lies. The music swelled, ancient strings and pipes calling guests to the center of the hall. The Lord's eyes found Lysandra across the crowd, a look that felt like a hand closing around her wrist, guiding without touching. As tradition dictated, the Lord opened the dancing with Lady Celine, their movements formal and precise. Others joined, a swirl of color and forced laughter. Lysandra remained still, watching as the patterns formed and dissolved, until suddenly the music shifted, and the Lord stood before her, hand extended. The observance dance, he said quietly. Tradition demands I choose someone who embodies the spirit of endurance. The room stilled as she placed her hand in his. His touch was cool, but not cold, flesh and blood despite the rumors. As he led her to the center of the hall, she felt the weight of every stare, the collective intake of breath. They expect me to humiliate you, he murmured as they began to move, his hand at the small of her back guiding her through steps she'd never learned but somehow knew. To prove that you are nothing more than a failed experiment. And what do you expect? She asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or approval. I expect you to continue surprising them, as you have surprised me. They moved together like shadows merging at dusk, their steps leaving frost patterns on the stone beneath them, an ancient magic few noticed and none commented upon. The music surrounded them, became them, until Lysandra felt the boundaries between her body and the air dissolve. For those moments, she was neither possession nor prize, but simply a woman dancing with a man who saw her. When the music faded, he did not release her immediately. Instead, he spoke softly, for her ears alone. After midnight, come to the eastern tower. There are truths you must know before they try to destroy you. The spell broke as Lady Celine approached, her smile fixed but eyes murderous. How democratic of you, my lord, to elevate the commons so publicly. One might almost believe you've forgotten what separates us from them. Perhaps what separates us is not what you imagine, Celine, he replied, his tone light but warning clear. As the celebration continued, Lysandra felt a shift in the air, subtle as a change in wind direction before storm. The smiles grew sharper, the laughter more brittle. Something was unraveling in Valdemar, and she stood at its center, a needle-pulling thread through elaborate embroidery. In a quiet moment, she slipped away to a balcony overlooking the frozen gardens. Frost had transformed the dormant roses into crystal sculptures, beautiful and deadly. She sensed rather than heard someone approach, Councillor Derham, his thin frame rigid with purpose. As the dance floor cleared for the traditional exchange of frost gifts, tokens meant to ensure prosperity through winter's darkest months, Lysandra observed the subtle hierarchies at play. Those with highest status received their gifts first, displayed publicly with elaborate ceremony. Lesser nobles followed, their offerings acknowledged with decreasing enthusiasm. Servants received nothing, expected to find warmth in continued employment rather than material tokens. What no one expected was for the Lord himself to step forward, a small wooden box held in pale hands. Silence spread through the hall as he moved, not toward another noble, but directly to where Lysandra stood. Tradition dictates that those who embody winter's lessons receive winter's blessing, he stated, voice pitched to carry throughout the hall without seeming to raise it. No one here has demonstrated endurance with more dignity than the woman who came to us a stranger and stands now as testament. Lady Celine's face contorted briefly before smoothing into practiced neutrality. Councillor Derham's eyes narrowed with calculation. Among the gathered nobility, murmurs rippled outward, some scandalized, others intrigued by this deviation from protocol. The Lord opened the wooden box, revealing a pendant of clear crystal containing what appeared to be a single perfect snowflake, preserved eternally in its sacred geometry. "This belonged to the First Lady of Valdemar," he said, lifting it from its velvet nest. "It has awaited a worthy successor for 3 centuries." Gasps echoed through the hall. The pendant was not merely jewelry, but sacred artifact, symbol of Valdemar's covenant with winter itself. For it to be bestowed upon an outsider, a woman purchased for her barrenness, violated every unspoken rule of their society. As the Lord placed it around her neck, Lysandra felt its strange weight, heavier than its size suggested, cold against her skin, yet somehow warming rather than chilling. The crystal seemed to pulse with subtle light that synchronized with her heartbeat, creating the disconcerting sensation that the object recognized her in some elemental way. "What you have done cannot be undone," Lady Celine hissed as she passed, the words meant for the Lord, but her venomous gaze fixed on Lysandra. "Some traditions exist not by choice, but by necessity." "You have bewitched him," he stated flatly. "No natural explanation exists for his behavior." "Perhaps you have never understood him as well as you believed," she suggested, keeping her gaze on the icy landscape. "I have served Valdemar for 30 years, he hissed. "I watched him bury his heart with his first wife. I advised him through wars and plagues. I know what he is." "And what is that?" His laugh was hollow as wind through bone. "Something neither alive nor dead. Something that cannot love without destroying. Ask yourself why he surrounds himself with beautiful, young women who inevitably disappear. Ask yourself why this castle has a room that remains locked at all times." He leaned closer. "Ask yourself why the province provides him with blood tribute each solstice." Before she could respond, he pressed something cold and metal into her palm. "When the time comes, and it will, this will open any lock in Valdemar. Use it wisely, or become another ghost in a forgotten dress." He melted back into the celebration, leaving Lysandra with a small key and questions multiplying like frost across glass. Midnight approached with the inevitability of tide, and with it, the promise of truths that might prove more dangerous than any lie. Midnight arrived draped in silence. The celebration below had dissolved into drunken revelry, laughter echoing through stone corridors like the memory of warmth. Lysandra moved like shadow through the eastern wing, each step deliberate on the spiral staircase that wound upward into darkness. The small key Councillor Derham had pressed into her palm remained hidden in a fold of her gown, its weight disproportionate to its size. The eastern tower stood apart from the main structure, connected by a narrow bridge that spanned a chasm so deep that summer fog never fully revealed its bottom. Winter winds howled across this passage, carrying whispers that sounded almost like voices, pleading or warning, she couldn't tell. At the tower entrance, she hesitated. No guard stood watch, yet the doorway seemed protected by something more effective than steel or muscle. Hesitation itself, the natural reluctance to step beyond safety into truth. The door opened before she could knock. The Lord of Valdremore stood framed against amber lamplight, his formal attire exchanged for simpler garments that softened his silhouette. Here, away from performance, he appeared almost human, the angles of his face less severe, his posture carrying the subtle curve of exhaustion. "You came," he said, stepping aside to allow her entry. I wondered if fear would prove stronger than curiosity. "Fear and curiosity are not opposed," Lysandra replied, crossing the threshold. "Often they are companions." The chamber beyond defied her expectations. Rather than the cold austerity that defined the rest of Valdremore, this room breathed with life. Walls lined with books rose toward a ceiling painted with constellations. Plants flourished in ceramic vessels, herbs and flowers that should not bloom in winter. A fire crackled in a hearth of river stone, and before it sat 2 chairs, worn from use rather than age. Each step deeper into the chamber brought new revelations. The books were not merely decorative but well-used, their spines cracked with reading, pages marked with slips of paper covered in a precise, elegant handwriting. The plants were experimental, hybrids created through careful grafting, labeled with properties and effects. Scientific instruments occupied one corner, telescope, microscope, measuring devices of brass and silver. This was no lord's formal receiving room, but a scholar's sanctuary, a place where curiosity overrode station, where questions mattered more than answers. Lysandra felt something tight within her chest loosen slightly. Whatever else the Lord of Valdremore might be, here was evidence of a mind that valued discovery over dogma. "You did not expect this," he observed, watching her absorb her surroundings. "I expected a lord," she admitted. "I found a seeker." His expression softened fractionally. The two need not be mutually exclusive, though tradition often forces us to choose. Power without knowledge is merely force. Knowledge without purpose is merely distraction. "And what is your purpose?" she asked, moving toward a table where maps of the night sky were overlaid with diagrams of human anatomy, strange correlations drawn between constellations and organs, between lunar phases and blood cycles. "To understand what was done to my bloodline 3 centuries ago," he replied, voice dropping to match the intimacy of the confession. "And whether it can be undone without destroying what it protects." The statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Lysandra's fingers brushed the crystal pendant at her throat, the one that had belonged to the First Lady of Valdremore, the one that pulsed in time with her own heartbeat. "And I am part of this understanding." "You were meant to be part of the perpetuation," he corrected, moving to stand beside her. "A vessel for continuation, not comprehension. But from the moment you arrived, looking at me not with fear but with recognition." He paused, seeming to search for words precise enough for the complexity he described. "You made me question whether survival must come at such cost." "My sanctuary," he explained, watching her take in the room. "The one place where I am neither lord nor legend, but merely a man with questions that outlive their answers." "What questions merit such isolation?" she asked, drawn to a table covered with maps and astronomical charts. He moved beside her, close enough that she could sense the subtle rhythm of his breathing. "The nature of time, the boundaries between life and death, the price of immortality when it comes unsought." Her eyes met his. "Are these questions or confessions?" Something like pain flickered across his features. He turned toward a cabinet of dark wood and withdrew a leather-bound volume, so ancient the binding had begun to crumble. 300 years ago, this province faced extinction. Plague, famine, and war converged like horsemen. My ancestor, the first Lord of Valdremore, sought salvation through ancient rites. He sacrificed what he loved most to preserve what he ruled. His fingers traced patterns on the book's cover. The bargain succeeded, but its terms were imprecise. "What bargain?" Lysandra asked, though something in her already knew, had perhaps known since first passing through Valdremore's gates. Life extended beyond natural limits. A bloodline preserved through unnatural means. Protection for the province, so long as the Lord maintains his vigil. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. But there were conditions. There are always conditions when dealing with forces older than language. Understanding dawned like ice water through her veins. The women. The Barren women brought to Valdemar. He nodded, his expression a mask of controlled grief. The bargain requires renewal. A willing sacrifice, a life given, not taken. The province flourishes only when its lord remains sustained. Sustained by death, Lysandra stated, not a question but a clarification of horror. By freely given life force, he corrected, though the distinction seemed academic rather than moral. Only a woman who cannot create life can channel it to preserve another. That is why they brought you, why your family sold you. Your barrenness makes you valuable as vessel rather than vessel creator. The room seemed to tilt around her. Lysandra gripped the edge of a table, nails digging into ancient wood. And the others? The women before me. His silence told her everything. They had given themselves willingly, believing sacrifice noble, or perhaps simply finding death preferable to the circumstances that had brought them to Valdemar. Why tell me this? She demanded, anger rising like a tide. To prepare me? To make me complicit in my own destruction. To give you choice, he replied, his voice steady despite the storm in his eyes. Something none of them were truly given. Choice, she echoed, bitter as winter berries. Between death and what? Watching others die in my place. What choice exists within these walls? He moved toward the tower window, throwing it open to reveal the valley below, scattered lights of villages nestled in darkness. 3,000 souls depend on the protection of Valdemar. When plague comes, it passes us by. When famine strikes, our fields remain fertile. When war ravages the region, armies find themselves lost in mist before reaching our borders. He turned back to her, moonlight silvering his profile. If the bargain fails, if I fail, they suffer first and worst. His confession unlocked something in the air between them, a barrier both had maintained without acknowledging. For 3 centuries, the lords of Valdemar had accepted inheritance without question, feeding their unnatural longevity through sacrifice deemed necessary for greater good. Each lord passed to his heir not merely title and land, but burden of knowledge too terrible to share yet too consequential to forget. Show me the book, Lysandra said finally, extending her hand. Let me read the bargain for myself. Hesitation crossed his face. The original text is written in a language no living person speaks. What remains are translations made by those with reason to interpret favorably. Those with reason to ensure the sacrifice continues, she clarified. Lady Celine's family has served as interpreters for generations, he acknowledged. They guard the traditions and benefit from their maintenance. Understanding crystallized within Lysandra's mind the strange conversation she had overheard in the chambers beneath Valdemar, Lady Celine speaking to that voice of stone. Not merely enforcement of tradition, but active perpetuation of whatever power the sacrifices generated. There's more to this bargain than you've been told, she said, certainty growing with each heartbeat. Lady Celine's family hasn't merely preserved tradition, they've shaped it, perhaps even corrupted it. The Lord's expression shifted from resignation to focused intensity. What do you know? Last night, I followed her to chambers beneath the castle. She spoke with something, in a language I shouldn't have understood but somehow did. They spoke of vessels and culmination. Her hand rose unconsciously to the crystal pendant, which had grown warmer against her skin. They spoke of me as the 8th sacrifice, as if there were significance to that number. He moved toward her with sudden urgency, taking her hands in his. The 8th? You're certain? Yes. Why? Because according to the fragments I've translated myself, the original bargain spoke of 7 transitions, followed by transformation. 7 sacrifices followed by something else. Something Lady Celine's family has taken great care to obscure. His grip tightened. You were meant to be the final sacrifice in a sequence begun generations ago, not to maintain protection, but to complete some other purpose entirely. Lysandra felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders. So I am to sacrifice myself for strangers? No, the word fell between them with unexpected force. You are to know the truth, entirely, before deciding anything. Knowledge has been kept from these women for centuries. They were brought like lambs, ignorant and afraid. His hands clenched at his sides. I cannot continue that tradition. Not with you. Why? What makes me different? The question hung in the air between them, vibrating like a plucked string. He moved toward her slowly, as one might approach a wild creature, until they stood close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, marks of humanity in a face too perfect to be mortal. Because you look at me and see neither monster nor savior, but simply a man burdened by inheritance. Because your silence contains more truth than all the speeches of my counselors. Because when you dance, your body remembers joy your mind has forgotten. His voice lowered, because I would rather end this curse than extend it through your sacrifice. The confession shattered something in the air between them, a barrier neither had acknowledged. For 3 centuries, the lords of Valdemar had accepted their fate as protectors, feeding their unnatural longevity through the willing surrender of women deemed expendable. Yet here stood a lord willing to question the bargain itself. There must be another way, Lysandra said, mind racing through possibilities. If the original terms were imprecise, perhaps they can be reinterpreted. Perhaps. A sudden commotion from below interrupted her, shouts and the clash of metal, followed by the alarm bell's frantic pealing. They moved as one to the window. Below, in the courtyard, torches blazed as guards assembled. A rider had arrived, horse lathered with exertion, bearing news urgent enough to disturb the festival night. Something comes, the Lord murmured, already moving toward the door. Stay here. You'll be safer. No, Lysandra gathered her midnight gown, decision made in an instant. If I am to choose my fate, I must understand all that hangs in the balance. His eyes met hers, surprise yielding to something like respect. With a nod, he extended his hand, and together they descended toward whatever crisis had breached Valdemar's peace on this night when ancient powers stirred and new covenants formed. As they reached the courtyard, the rider, face bloodless with terror, delivered his news. Shadow creatures approached from the north, consuming all in their path. The villages had fallen. The province stood on the precipice of annihilation. Only the Lord of Valdemar stood between life and extinction. Only a willing sacrifice could renew the ancient protection. But as they stood there, snowflakes beginning to fall around them like stars descending to earth, Lysandra felt the crystal pendant pulse against her skin, not with her heartbeat now, but with something older and deeper, a rhythm that matched the subtle vibration she had felt in the castle's foundations. The knowledge she sought had been with her since the moment the Lord placed the First Lady's pendant around her neck. The first sacrifice wasn't death, she whispered, revelation unfolding like frost patterns across glass. It was transformation. The Lord turned to her, understanding dawning in his eyes. The First Lady didn't die, she became something else. A bridge between worlds, not a door slammed shut. The women who followed weren't meant to die, but to maintain that connection until... Her voice trailed off as comprehension crystallized fully, until the 8th could complete what the first began. Lady Selene emerged from the shadows, her crimson gown now augmented with ritual symbols that gleamed with unnatural light. "Clever girl," she said, voice honeyed with false praise. "You've pieced together fragments of truth, but you misunderstand their import." "I think not," Lysandra countered, standing straighter. "Your family corrupted the original covenant. What began as transformation, you twisted into destruction. What should have been bridge building became barrier enforcing." Around them, the air thickened with tension. In the distance, at the edge of the forest, shapes moved, neither fully animal nor human, creatures of shadow and frost advancing with inexorable purpose. "The 8th sacrifice completes the sequence," Lady Selene declared, raising her arms in ritual gesture. "Your death opens the final gate." "No," Lysandra replied, her voice carrying new resonance as the crystal pendant flared with inner light. "The 8th sacrifice remakes the bargain. Not to end, but to transform. Not to die, but to choose." With deliberate movement, she removed the iron ring that had been her grandmother's legacy, the one symbol of her life before captivity. She pressed it into the Lord's palm, folding his fingers around it. "Keep this," she said softly, "to remember that some chains can be broken only by pretending to accept them." Before he could respond, she turned toward the advancing shadows, toward Lady Selene's triumphant expression, toward the fate generations of women had faced without true understanding. I make this sacrifice freely, she announced, voice carrying across the courtyard where guards and nobles alike stood frozen in tableau. Not my death, but my transformation. Not my ending, but my beginning. The crystal pendant blazed like captured starlight. From within its facets emerged the truth Lady Celine's family had concealed for centuries, that the bargain was never meant to trap, but to transcend. That protection came not through death, but through willing evolution. That what sustained Valdemar was not the extinguishing of flame, but its transmutation into new form. As snow fell around her, Lysandra felt herself changing, not diminishing, but expanding. Her awareness stretched beyond flesh, beyond the boundaries of single consciousness. The cold entered her not as enemy, but as essence, winter's wisdom flowing through veins that had once carried only mortal blood. The shadow creatures hesitated at the edge of the courtyard, recognizing in her something both familiar and transformed, winter's voice-given human form, cold's necessary wisdom embodied rather than imprisoned. Lady Celine screamed in frustration as centuries of careful manipulation unraveled in a single moment of true choice. The Lord of Valdemar stood transfixed, witnessing what his ancestors had glimpsed but never fully understood, that their protection came not from taking life, but from honoring its capacity to transcend form. Lysandra, once sold as currency and intended as sacrifice, became instead the voice that bridged worlds. Her barrenness not curse but power, empty vessel filled now with understanding no mortal container could hold completely. Winter would always come, as it must. But now it came as teacher rather than terror, as counterpoint to summer's abundance rather than its nemesis. The bargain was not broken but fulfilled, not ended but evolved. The price not life, but understanding. And in that knowledge, Valdemar would endure, not through blood and bargains, but through wisdom hard-won and truth long delayed. End of story. If the story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what makes us most human.